In 2007, in a flat green field in northern France, a man stood at the edge of a small copse of trees and watched a machine sweep the ground. He was not an archaeologist, and he was not a historian. He had come from Melbourne to stand in a field that officially held nothing. For 7 years, he had been telling the Australian government that there were 250 missing men lying under that field. For 7 years, he had been told, politely at first, and then less politely, that he was wrong. Before that afternoon was finished, the machine would turn up something small enough to hold between 2 fingers, and the argument would be over. The story of those 7 years begins 91 years earlier, in that same field, on a night when somebody shouted a sentence into the dark. The Somme offensive opened on the 1st of July, 1916. 18 days later, 80 kilometers to the north, in French Flanders, the British and Australian armies attacked a low rise called Aubers Ridge, near a village called Fromelles. It was not meant to take ground. It was a feint, intended to keep the Germans from sending their reserves south to the Somme. The men given the job were the 5th Australian Division, the newest and least prepared in France, in its first major action on the Western Front. They went in alongside the British 61st against a German strongpoint called the Sugarloaf, concrete, wire, and machine guns. The attack went in at 6 in the evening on the 19th of July. An Australian sergeant named Jimmy Downing wrote down what it looked like. Hundreds were mown down in the flicker of an eyelid, he wrote, like great rows of teeth knocked from a comb. In roughly 24 hours, the 5th Australian Division lost 5,533 men. Almost 2,000 of them were killed or died of wounds. More than 400 were taken prisoner. The British division alongside them lost another 1,500. The Australian War Memorial believes it to be the greatest loss suffered by a single division in 24 hours in the whole of the First World War. The ground gained was nothing. Not a meter held. Brigadier General Harold Elliott had argued against the plan before it went in. He called it a wretched hybrid scheme, which might well be termed a tactical abortion. Simon Fraser was a farmer from Biaduc in Western Victoria. He was born in 1877, which made him 38 when he enlisted in July 1915, old enough to be the father of half the men beside him. He had already given 9 years to the Victorian Mounted Rifles before the war started. In the nights before the attack, Fraser was one of the men sent crawling out in front of the line to cut the German wire in the dark. He was mentioned in dispatches for it, distinguished and gallant services and devotion to duty. Then the attack failed, and the wounded were left where they fell. An informal local truce started up in one sector so that men could be brought in. Major General James Mackay, commanding the division, ordered it halted. The wounded stayed out there. Some of them lay in the open for days. A few lay there a week. So for 3 days and 3 nights, Australians went out into no man's land, under fire, and carried them in by hand. Simon Fraser was one of the men who went out. He went out again and again and again. On the 31st of July, he sat down and wrote a letter home. It is a plain letter, almost apologetic about how rough the work was. Some of these wounded were game as lions, he wrote, and got rather roughly handled, but haste was more necessary than gentle handling. And then, describing one trip out, he wrote this. Another man about 30 yards out sang out, "Don't forget me, cobber." I went in and got 4 volunteers with stretchers, and we got both men in safely. Don't forget me, cobber. 4 words shouted out of the dark by a wounded man who could see the Australian line and could not reach it. Nobody has ever established who he was. Not in 1916, and not in the 110 years since. The war moved on. Fromelles did not. On Armistice Day, the 11th of November, 1918, Charles Bean walked the old ground at Fromelles. 2 years and 4 months had passed. What he wrote down was this: "We found the old no-man's land simply full of our dead. The skulls and bones and torn uniforms were lying about everywhere." After the war, the burial parties came through and did what they could. 410 Australians were recovered from that battlefield and buried together at a place called VC Corner. Not one of them could be identified. It has no individual headstones because there was nobody to put a name on. There was a memorial wall instead, and when it went up, it carried close to 1,300 names of Australians killed at Fromelles who had no known grave. Simon Fraser survived Fromelles. He was commissioned second lieutenant and posted to the 58th Battalion. In May 1917, 10 months after he wrote that letter, he was killed at the Second Battle of Bullecourt. He was 40 years old. His body was never recovered. He has no known grave. The man who went out 3 nights running so that no one would be left lying in a field was left lying in a field. His name is cut into a wall at Villers-Bretonneux with the rest of Australia's missing, and that wall is the closest thing he has to a headstone. In 1998, a sculpture was unveiled on the ground at Fromelles. It shows a soldier with a wounded man across his shoulders, carrying him in. The soldier is Simon Fraser. The man on his shoulders has no identity, because the man who called out never had one. It is called cobbers. In the year 2000, a Melbourne art teacher named Lambis Englezos read a book about the Battle of Fromelles. It was written by a man named Robin Corfield. The title was peculiar, to say the least. Englezos was Greek-born, and he had no standing in military history whatsoever. He spent his working days teaching teenagers to draw. What he had was an eye for a number that did not add up. The Germans had recorded burying Allied dead behind their own lines after the battle. The Allied cemeteries and memorials did not account for those men. When Englezos worked the arithmetic of the Fromelles missing, roughly 250 of them came out the other side unexplained. So an art teacher began pulling files. In the Red Cross wounded and missing file of a soldier named Jack Bowden, he found a reference to a burial near a place called Pheasant Wood. He found rectangular disturbances in 1916 aerial photographs of the ground behind the old German line, and a local French historian told him what the farmers there had always said. In 2005, he put it to a panel of experts, and the panel was not persuaded. He kept going anyway, for 2 more years, on a theory that professional historians had already heard and declined. He would describe the whole thing afterwards as serendipity and chance. Then, in 2006, in the Bavarian War Archives in Munich, somebody found the order. The Germans had written it down in 1916, the instruction to bury the Allied dead behind their lines. In 2007, a survey team from Glasgow University came to the field with metal detectors. On the night of the 19th of July, 1916, the Australians never reached that ground. Not one of them got that far. Whatever was in it did not walk there. That is where the detector found it. A small Australian good luck medallion issued by the Shire of Alberton in Victoria, of the kind given to a soldier named Harry Willis when he enlisted. It could not tell them who was down there. It told them they were digging in the right place. In 2008, a limited dig confirmed there were human remains under the field. In 2009, a full excavation went in under Oxford Archaeology, led by Dr. Louise Lowe. They opened 5 pits. They recovered 250 men. Century-old bone will not give up ordinary DNA, so the identifications were made on lineage markers, matched against living families who came forward and gave samples. The standard was not proof beyond reasonable doubt. It was, in the project's own words, substantially more likely than not. In the first months of 2010, 249 of those men were buried, one at a time, in a new cemetery at Fromelles. On the 17th of March that year, the first identification board reported. It gave names to 75 of them. One of the 75 was Harry Willis. On the 19th of July, the 94th anniversary of the attack, the cemetery was dedicated. The 250th man, still without a name, was buried during the ceremony itself. And then the work simply kept going, year after year, long after the cameras left. 75 names in 2010, 144 by 2014, 180 by 2024. As of this month, 181 of those 250 men have their names back. 69 still do not. 5 days ago, on the 19th of July, 2026, the 110th anniversary of the battle, a headstone was dedicated at Fromelles for Private Roy Martin of Cobber, New South Wales. Simon Fraser is not in that cemetery. He died 10 months later at Bullecourt, and he was never found. Whatever those 250 men got back, he did not get. And the wounded man 30 yards out, the one who shouted, he is not there either. He was never identified. Not then, and not since. He is not on a list. He is one sentence in another man's letter, and that is all he has ever been. Until Robin Corfield used that peculiar line to title his book, "Don't Forget Me, Cobber." Nobody could keep that promise for the man who said it. Nobody could keep it for the man who wrote it down. They kept it for 250 other men instead, and 110 years on, they are keeping it still.